Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines and I am the Continuing Education Consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries located in sunny Boise, Idaho. Our webinars and other continuing education opportunities are funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Everyone is muted and we encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions and discuss with other attendees. As you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your honest feedback. Today's topic is about visual literacy in graphic novels and comics. And our presenter is Laura Johnston. Take it away, Laura.
Hello, everyone. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so you can all see my slides. Perfect. And these will all be available to you. I sent Annie a PDF that you should all have access to if you want them. I am a high school librarian here in Boise. And before that, I was a bookseller at an independent bookstore for 8 years. And I worked very closely with kids and teen literature there. I was a kids' book buyer at that store. And so it is something I'm very passionate about. And incorporating graphic novels into a curriculum and recommending them at all ages is something that has just become kind of a passion project for mine. So I'm really excited to talk to you all. I think whether you're a public librarian or a school librarian, uh, this is information that's can be useful for readers advisory or like if you have people who like have like a real like reticence or pushback against graphic novels. This gives, I think, a great like background of information about the topic. So first, let's talk about visual literacy. So visual literacy is just like what we commonly think of as literacy. It is being able to not only like take in and understand visual, multimodal, complex media forms, but also to like create them and just like be a part of that conversation, like reading and writing. So think of that as being able to interpret visual media and to also be able to create it. And I think it's like a really, really vital skill to have in our society that is increasingly visual. Like if you just think about how much of visual media you take in on any given day, it's enormous. And if you think about the training that we have to analyze and dissect visual media is very, very small in most cases, unless you've taken a specific art class about composition or rhetoric or something like that. There is really very little training. And one of the things that kind of started me on my journey to learn more about this was this quote from the film critic: we're really visually sophisticated and totally visually illiterate. And so I just want to break that down a little bit. And because we are very visually sophisticated, we can take a look at an image or a video and there's a lot going on and we can derive a whole lot of information from it, but we don't necessarily have the tools to like dissect how we're getting that information, to really analyze the modes and the means that information is communicated to us. So I think it's really vital to kind of learn how to do that, but it's something that, just like reading and interpreting literary texts, you have to be taught how to do that. It requires explicit instruction, and even just kind of being aware that it's something that you should be asking and paying attention to is like part of the battle. So even you now already having just two or three slides in, knowing to ask these questions is is already a good thing. So we have a visual vocabulary just like we have a text vocabulary. And I'm used to giving this talk in front of a live audience and having a lot of feedback and asking questions. So I feel a little bit like I'm shouting in the void. But like, look at this picture. It's an example from Understanding Comics, which is a great book that I hope you all have a chance to look at. I learned a lot from this book. And I think this was the image that really struck me as being a good way of describing visual vocabulary, because these same squiggly lines above the pipe means smoke, something that we can see. And those identical squiggly lines on top of the garbage is something that we smell and that we can't see. And we just have picked up the vocabulary and the understanding that in different contexts, those same basic lines can mean very different things. And that visual vocabulary extends to things like icons, emojis, traffic signs. Like there are things that are kind of universal even across cultures and countries. Logos, the attachment of colors to emotions, that kind of thing. Those are all part of a shared visual vocabulary that we have that we might not have just known to put that name to it. This is one of my favorite examples of how context affects visual vocabulary. Just like the smoke and the smell of garbage is dependent on context, it's like a language and it can change by culture. So this is my kind of outlandish hyperbolic example of this, that in a US cartoon, the bulging eyes, perhaps the tongue hanging out in the drool, would indicate that somebody walked into the room who was overwhelmingly attractive. And in Japan, and like their kind of cartoony, over the top way of depicting that is an explosive bloody nose, which, if you're not familiar with Japanese media, sounds totally bonkers, but it's based off of like an old folk tale in Japan. And so it's part of their visual vocabulary. And so it's kind of like learning a foreign language, learning what their cultural contexts bring to a visual vocabulary. So you can learn visual cues just like you learn words in a different language. Also, the context of age is really interesting. Visuals and images work kind of like language in that they change in meaning over time. And we're kind of watching that happen in real time with how different generations use and communicate with emojis, which I think is really fascinating. So, the general takeaway from that is that we have a visual vocabulary just like we have a verbal vocabulary. And when we have those complex meanings packaged into these like very easily transmissible images, we're able to really grapple with a lot of meaning very, very quickly. We're visual creatures, so we can take in a lot of complex meanings very quickly with visuals. So, visual vocabulary implies visual grammar. And I think the reason that the visual literacy conversation and the graphic novel conversation are part of the same conversation to me is that graphic novels are an incredibly good way of teaching these rules, of learning these rules and examining these rules. And because there's like, you're already familiar with kind of the story structure, but the you can use what you already know about reading books to then examine what you don't know and aren't used to analyzing. These are two separate pages from a really cool book called The Magic Fish. And I picked these two pages because it shows how some visual grammar rules are pretty universal. So on the left-hand side, you see like the prow of a boat. You see a whole boat in the distance, and then just a prow. If we're looking at just these like amber colored slots right here. You see just the prow of the boat, and you see this person right here. And then we seem to be zooming in on that person. And then we see just her face and just her eye. And I say we seem to be zooming in because we are not physically moving, but because of visual grammar of us getting a larger piece of that whole, like one piece of that getting larger and cropping out the other things, we have the experience of getting closer to that, even though we're not physically getting any closer to our screens. And similarly, in these blue panels right here, we see the bubbles, and then we see the top of a head, and then we see a full head. And so we automatically put those in sequence so that we imagine a head coming out of the water. That head is not actually coming out of the water, but having those pictures in sequence, we understand implies the movement out of the water. So those are examples of rules of visual grammar that are pretty universal. You've probably never thought about it, but that's a rule you already knew. One thing about this book that is unique to this book is that it created a visual grammar around color. So you can see that there are three different colors in this book. And this is a story of a boy. He is Vietnamese American, and his mother speaks mostly Vietnamese and he speaks mostly English. And to kind of better communicate and spend time together, they're reading some fairy tales together. And all of the present moments are in this kind of rosy pinkish color. All of the stories that they're reading show up in this blue color. And every once in a while, the stories that they are reading trigger a memory, specifically of her emigrating and fleeing Vietnam. And those show up in this kind of amber yellow color. And what this allows the author to do is to show you that these are all happening simultaneously. So they are both in a room together and they are visualizing the fairy tale, and she is having a flashback. And because the panels are mixed together, you understand that they're happening concurrently. On the right hand side, you see this is near the end of the book, and there is the sort of final fairy tale ball. Prince gets together with the princess moment. And you see right here where they're bleeding together. This person in the pink shirt is bleeding together. These stars travel across. And this is what's happening in the present, where this boy asks his crush to dance, the school dance, and they get to dance together for the first time. And it's like his fairy tale ending. And so we understand that reality is bleeding into his kind of concept of a fairy tale. And that part of that is happening because of the color conversation he's established throughout the whole book. So, if these are such rich and interesting texts, and this is such a vital skill to learn, you might be asking yourself, well, why aren't we teaching this? Why aren't these in the curriculum? And we're going to talk about that. And I, as a bookseller, and even in my time as a librarian, I've often got a lot of pushback to bringing them into the classroom, to teaching them critically, or even like when parents didn't want to buy them for their kids. And a lot of times it would really, like, a kid would be very excited about buying a book, and then the parent would say, I could predict it. It's like every single time they're like, no, don't recommend my kid graphic novels. I want them to read real books. And so they put back the book that they were excited about, and it kind of like tamped down all of that enthusiasm that they had. And I was just kind of flabbergasted at the time, why wouldn't you want your kids to read that? And so these are kind of the pushback answers that I got from parents and then educators. They thought they were too fast or easy, and it like dumbs down the content, and that this is like not as high a form of art as like literature, and that kids don't have to use their imagination. Like, I want them to read books so that they are imagining things that are happening, and it's like better for their brain or whatever. So these are the things that I would often hear from parents. However, all of this is wrong. And I think to understand why we have this conception, we have to do just like a very brief history of graphic novels and comics as a format. Some of the earliest pieces of literature, before we even really had formalized writing, we had visual stories. And this is from literally all over the planet. Like, as early as we were painting on walls, we were telling stories as a species through images. It is a fundamental, primal human impulse to tell stories with images. The closest thing we get to a predecessor of the modern comic are these sort of uh, gossip sheets, sort of. They were kind of like political cartoons that came about in the 19th century in Europe, very, very popular in England specifically, but they were often used as a way of communicating with lower classes that didn't have access to education, so they were not necessarily literate. So they could kind of get the gist of it without having to read it. But if they had like one person that could read the title or the caption, they could still kind of communicate with people who could not read. This is also a time when you could mass produce images really for the first time easily with some of the early kind of woodcuts and lithographic technology. So as the technology was able to share images, we started doing that. We got our first kind of comic strip, the Sunday Funnies, in the 1890s, so at the end of the 19th century. This established some of the norms of like the speech bubbles essentially kind of came from this. This is the Yellow Kids, often thought of as kind of like the first of the Sunday Funnies. The sequential images instead of just one image with a caption, which is still how you see a lot of political cartoons. They still use that kind of old school early 19th century format of one image with a caption, whereas the Sunday Funnies were the first time we saw like sequential images telling a story. Um, show anyway. Um, so we started to see, um, sorry, that image didn't load. I'll figure that out in the PDF for you guys. Um, when people started to do more artsy stuff with this format, they tried to take themselves away from this connotation with the sort of like lowbrow comedy, the lower classes, that kind of thing, by changing what they were calling them, the woodcut novel, the collage novel. And we saw this later with the birth of the term graphic novel as opposed to comic. It was a way of making it sound more elite and artsy, if you will, just by changing the name of it. And it wasn't until the golden age of comic books, and you'll probably recognize Action Comics, Detective Comics, the birth of the superhero comic books, that the outside of the like Sunday Funnies, that this became a format that was widely successful. This it just exploded in, like 10 or 20 years, just became this massive, massive industry. And this became a very prevalent format. However, in the 1950s, at the peak of, like sort of the McCarthy era, there was just like a particular milieu that might feel familiar if you're in the library world right now. Was a book written that implied that comic books were basically what was causing juvenile delinquency, that depictions of violence, sex, and drugs were going to convert all of your kids into drug using homosexuals, was like pretty much the takeaway of this book. It was not really founded on any kind of real science or sociology that we would call methodologically sound today. But it caught the eye of a senator who had a televised subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. And if you think back to the 1950s when there were like four TV channels, if something was televised, almost the entire country watched it. And so there was this big moral panic because this senator essentially said the comic books were more dangerous to youth than Hitler. And this is less than 10 years after the end of World War II. So people started freaking out, and so did the comic book industry, because this the subcommittee was in spring, and by fall, 15 comic book publishers had gone out of business. So the publishers ran scared and they started doing this sort of self censorship called the Comics Code Authority, where they would give this like stamp on a book that said that it didn't have anything bad in it. And they were pretty strict. Like you couldn't even like really question authority. You couldn't have any quote unquote bad guys that had redeeming characters or anything. It really flattened a lot of texture and art in these books. And so that was the dawn of the silver age of comics books. But that decimation of the entire publishing industry and the way that this set people's understandings and opinions about comic books had ripple effects for decades. So it wasn't until more than 20 years later that Will Eisner, that we named the Eisner Award after, coined the term graphic novel. Again, to sort of like rebrand, get away from the stink of the term comic book that had all these negative things attached to it socially. But it wasn't until the 80s and 90s that we started to see the graphic novel recognized as a like real artistic medium outside of like the niche community of people reading it. And that was, of course, Mouse. Mouse was like a big, it got people outside of the normal comic book reader to read a comic book for the very first time. And it was the first time people were like, oh, there's something going on here that's not just superheroes. It's not just kid stuff. And that was a really big deal. But there wouldn't be another major book award won by a graphic novel until the 2000s. And so you in library world are probably familiar with this. We started with kind of a trickle where American Born Chinese kind of broke into the Youth Media Awards and the National Book Awards. And then you saw a few more and a few more. And now it's pretty normal to see some comics show up in book awards, both for kids and adults. It's more normal now than it has been for forever. So I think that we're in kind of a new golden age. Like our printing capacity for full text and full color and like glossy pages is like it's never been before. The like web comic things that we have access to are bigger and better than we've ever had before. There is so much incredibly good content coming out. And I think we have finally recovered from the 50s is how I see this. Like this is the us getting back on the trajectory we might have had. So I think it's important to have that context to understand the like cultural baggage that this format has had to crawl its way past to get where it is now. But I do want to address the ways in which some of these criticisms have merit. Like because I can understand the parent that sees their kid blowing through 8 volumes of manga a day and is like, what are they getting out of this? This is a waste of money. Like, they're not really reading. And I can understand that perspective. And some of that is that they have not been taught how to read the full image. They're reading the text and they are skimming the images, and that does allow you to read very quickly. And to some degrees, I would argue that that is a bonus, not a detraction, because it allows you to reread things and get new things every time because you can read very quickly. And I think that can be a real benefit. And um, as long as it's being used well, as long as they're being taught how to slow down and read critically, I think that they would read a little bit slower if you're taught that the same way that you were taught how to read text, right? I also want to address the idea that this is easy. And like I said before, we're visual creatures. We're designed to get a lot of information from visual input very quickly. So I like to say if you draw a smiley face with your dominant hand and then draw a smiley face with your non-dominant hand, the smiley face itself does not get more complicated, but one is easier than the other. And that's because we're hardwired to be good at that. And for humans, that's we're hardwired to be good at intaking visual information. And what's really interesting about the graphic novel is that you're using your visual and verbal parts of your brain at the same time, and this is why you have better recall when you read things that have both text and images. There's a reason that they put illustrations in textbooks. It's because you get more information, you have more like sort of like memory holes attached in your brain to that information so that you have like more instances of recall available to you. So it is actually like very good for your brain, and it might feel easy, but your brain is actually doing quite a lot of work. The other thing that I want to address is the idea that graphic novels are not a high form of art. And what I like to remind people is that it's a format and not a genre. Most people, you hear the word comic book, you think superheroes in tights. And there's nothing wrong with superheroes in tights. In fact, I think there are some incredible pieces of literature that are superhero comics. But it's a format and not a genre. So just like Citizen Kane is not the same as Hangover 2, like the film is a format, it's not a genre. Like you can use the same format to make incredibly simple things and incredibly complex things. You can make great art, you can make low art. And I mean, I don't have a problem with low art either. I find that to be just as valuable. But if you're wanting incredible works of art and literature, you can find that in this format also. Now, I want to address the idea that kids don't have to use their imagination in the graphic novels, which I totally disagree with. So I want you to take a little bit of time and look at this page from a comic while I aggressively hydrate. Okay, I love this word gutterance. The gutter is the space between the panels. And so it takes the word gutter and combines it with utterance. And essentially, that is what is being said in the gutter, the space between the panels. And there are things that the author chooses to draw and things that they leave to your imagination to animate for yourself. And so some of the work of reading a graphic novel is essentially you making assumptions and animating the space between panels. So if you look at this top panel here, it's clear that this character was sitting here and rushed off in the middle of this person's sentence. These people look shocked. There's a knocked over glass, right? So we are making that assumption. We are imagining that all of that action ourselves. And then we have to assume that she ran off, grabbed a coat and an umbrella because we see her running from the right side of the panel, fidgeting with the umbrella, getting frustrated, abandoning it, and running off the left side of the panel. So in my brain, I animate this whole thing as if I am a static viewer. She runs in from the right, throws away the umbrella, and then runs off to the left. All of that is something that I am animating in my brain. And I love this particular panel because this little swoop in the the tail of this bubble telling me the sound that he is whistling, the kind of up and down notes that he's whistling, and then he's literally hit in the back of the head by her yelling at him from the back. And then you see down like there's very little happening in the background. We're just like assuming it is very rainy, it is dark. But in this bottom panel here, we don't see any background. We don't even see the rain. We kind of see it as it impacts like our visibility, like you can see the streaks, the lines in front of them, but the background disappears. And the author is doing that because she wants the focus to be between these two people, because for them also everything outside of what is happening between them disappears. But we like know that it's still raining. We put the background in ourselves in this image, but are also allowed to see what is important in this scene. So, even though I think that all readers benefit and can enjoy graphic novels, I do also want to talk about the people that benefit the most from this kind of format being put in their hands as kids or put it in their classroom. So I love this term, illiterate readers, which I came across while I was researching this topic. These are often called reluctant readers, but I love this term because it attaches to their feelings about reading rather than their ability to read. And because there are a lot of people who have decent literacy, they just don't have a positive reading experience. You know, they don't like it, and that is different than somebody who has literacy deficits. And so some kids who have not had a positive experience reading, if they have this different format, they oftentimes have a very different experience. They can take, if they have any kind of negative experience in the past with a book or with a teacher, this can be like a new chance, a fresh chance to build a more positive reading identity for them. And down here, students with literacy deficits, this is a great way to boost their comprehension and academic performance because, again, when you mix text and images, it boosts recall. There's evidence to support that kids test better when the information is given with images supporting text. And if they're having some issues with comprehension, that visual scaffolding is going to help them comprehend those words. That same thing helps multi-language learners. So kids who are learning English as a second language, the vocabulary acquisition that they get when they have the words with the images is so high, especially because in graphic novels, a lot of the text is dialogue. And so you get a lot of that spoken language literacy because it's not necessarily that like strict, like we talk differently than we usually write. But in graphic novels, since there's so much dialogue, a lot of it is very conversational language. And you tend to get more rare words per word in a graphic novel. I love this example. In the first 5 pages of Persepolis, for example, you get the words obligatory, decadence, avant garde, prophet, predecessors, Zarathustra, Neruz, and disciple, which I think anybody working with teenagers knows those are all pretty good vocabulary words that you will just like pick up in context from those pages. And the other thing is visual and spatial thinkers. So these are kids that may or may not have had success in English classes before, but like if they have a harder time with text rich assessments, if you give them a way in that same context of like an English class to use the things that they're good at, to be a visual and spatial thinker, and to use those tools and put that towards character analyzation or scene structure or plot. Like if they're able to use those skills, that can really change how they engage with that skill set overall when they can then apply it to a text. So in general, we've always kind of used this text and images mixed together. It's good for all ages. It's why we have infographics. It's why we have flashcards. It's good for all types of learners. And this is a quote that I kind of take out of context. It's from an article about like using phonics, I think, to teach like preschoolers how to read. But I really love this sentiment, and I'm stealing it to use for why we should all be reading comics and why we should be recommending them and why we should be teaching them. They are helpful for all, they are harmful for none, and crucial to some. And I think that that is just like a good perspective to have. So hopefully I have now convinced you of why they're awesome and why you should be reading them and reading them critically. So let's talk about how to actually do that. So a graphic narrative is when you take pictures, you put them in order, and they tell a story, right? This is another I mentioned earlier. This is a book that is, if you want to know more, this is the it's always recommended by every time I've ever gone to a talk about graphic novels. Everybody recommends this book because it is really the gold standard. It'll teach you so much. So first, let's just all have the same vocabulary, the anatomy of a graphic novel. The panels, you'll probably already know that word. We've already talked about gutters. That's the space between the panels. Tiers are just rows of panels. They sometimes look like this and sometimes they don't, depending on the artist. They can be different sizes, different shapes. Bleed is an image that goes beyond the edge of the page, sometimes goes behind or around other panels. And here's an example of what that looks like in an actual graphic novel. Okay. This is from Frizzy, which is adorable. A splash page can be one page or two pages. Two pages that are side by side, we call a spread. And sometimes something will stretch across both pages, or like the two pages are talking to each other. So when we're talking about two pages face to face, we call that a spread. A splash is an image that's usually like an establishing shot. You often see them at the beginnings of books, beginnings of chapters or sections, but it can also be like a pivotal change where you're getting like a larger context or introduction to a space or a character. Like if it was in film, it would be the establishing shot. We pan over the skyline of, a city, we see the Space Needle and we're like, "Oh, we're in Seattle." And then the next scene, we're in an apartment and we make the assumption that this apartment is in Seattle. So the establishing shot would be like a splash page with the the cityscape in the background as an example. Here's another example with just like one page. And I wanted to show this other example to show inset panels. This is a cool thing that graphic novels can do that other media can't, like not even film, where we see this like big pivotal moment of this thing happening where it's zoomed out into a splash page. And because of those inset panels, we're able to see this from two perspectives at the same time. We see the close up on this character's face and their reaction as we see this event happening live. So that is a cool thing that graphic novels can do. So if we were in person, I would say pop quiz: is this a bleed panel or a splash page? So you can think about that for a second and just decide amongst yourselves what you think it is. And this one it's a little bit of a trick question because it does in some ways like cover both the full spread of both pages and have panels on top of it. So you might argue that these are all inset panels. But I think since most of this is covered and it functions more as a background, that this is a bleed panel rather than a splash page. So this layout is, I love this example because it's from a really funny graphic novel. It's Scandinavian. And one of the things about layout is that space equals time. And so you see these small boxes next to each other. So a bunch of small panels should give you the implication of speed. So somebody really shredding on this guitar, for example. And then this bleed panel down here, when you look at it, it looks very dramatic. Is backlit. You're getting the perspective from like his feet. It looks like he's playing in this big dome, like super dramatic. And that is how it feels. And then you go to the next page and realize he's just playing in some dude's apartment for one guy on a couch. And so the way that this is laid out, the perspective and the focus gives you an understanding of how this scene feels and then contrast it with like the reality. And it's sort of like a visual joke. It's like a point of humor that you're like, oh, this is so intense. This is so huge. And then you see this one dude on the couch. And that is, it's a visual grammar joke, which I think is very, very cool. So that's just like an early example of how to examine layout. I have a couple examples of like very cool layouts. Like I said, panels are not always square. Sometimes they are different shapes for different reasons. I love that this bottom panel, like the balloon that is attached here, is the same balloon, but it becomes its own panel up here. And you see this zoom in of these details. I just think it's a cool layout. I think that these are an example of incredible artistry in comic books, like superhero comic books, like the way that this layout shows motion and time, I think is very, very cool. The other thing that you've got to know about in the basic anatomy of a graphic novel are the different types of text. You're probably familiar with speech bubbles and thought balloons. Text captions you might not have thought about before. They were often not, they're not dialogue, they're usually description or narration or something like that. So this is El Defo, so this is a memoir. So most of the narration is her talking about her past. The other thing that I love in this one is these look like panels, but they're not. They're Polaroid pictures with little captions written on them. And we call that environmental text. And you have to remember that, like, every piece of text that's put on a page in a graphic novel was put there for a reason. So, the signs in the background, a piece of newspaper on the ground, the titles of the books on a shelf behind somebody's head, all of that is important to like slow down and read and examine because that was put there for a reason by the artist. And then we, of course, have special effects lettering. And I love this because it's part text and part illustration because the size, the font, the shape, all of that is very important. The color, even, is very important. Like the size and shape of this chunk and chank is very different than this zwip zwip of the arrows. This, like, him breathing hard as he's running, is this like he barely has any breath. So it's small and almost disappears into the background because it's so small. The speech bubble is bigger than he is, so he's shouting. So this text is part onomatopoeia, part illustration, and I think that that's a cool thing that happens in graphic texts. I put this here as just a little primer for anybody who, speaking of layout, who's nervous to try manga. Even people who read graphic novels, if they're not manga readers, they can be kind of intimidated by it. And I was too. But it really, like, once you kind of get into it a couple pages, your brain kind of adapts and it becomes much less scary, in my opinion. And so the only tricky thing is that you're going right to left. You're still going top to bottom, but right to left. And the thing that tripped me up at the beginning is it's not just right page before left page, but it's the right side of the panel before the left side of the panel. So that'll be there for your reference if you are nervous and want to give that a shot. So, the real work of reading a graphic novel critically and not just reading the text is reading the images and also the layout. So, interpreting composition. And there are whole classes that you can and maybe should take about interpreting composition, but it all starts with asking the right questions, right? They're a specifically choreographed experience. Like I said, every inch of that page is something that the artist, the letterer, a lot of people had to work on and sign off on so that every single part of that page is important to look at and ask why they made those decisions. And that is really good practice to then take into the rest of your life as part of information literacy in a very visual world. So, like, think about how That could be helpful in the workplace, in determining whether or not things are AI images or not. In the library world, we just brought in a book that we bought off of Amazon because a kid, requested it and we got it. And I was like, this is AI generated. Like, look, Lionel Messi has 8 fingers in this page. So being able to like look critically at images and interpreting whole visual text like that can be a very good like life skill to develop just by starting to ask these questions. So this is usually what I have a lot of more um, participation from people, but in this context, it's a little bit more difficult. So usually, I have people practice interpreting composition, and and if you're just getting started with this kind of thing in this conversation, I think it's important to ask yourself these 3 questions. What is being presented to me? How is it being presented to me? And why? Why were those decisions being made? So just take a look at these. This is a spread, 2 pages from The Arrival, which is a completely wordless graphic novel. It's about, I don't know, it's either 10 or 20 years old. It's pretty old, but it's for me an absolute masterpiece. Just like everybody should own it and read it. It's amazing. So take a minute to look at this and ask yourself these questions, and then I will kind of walk you through how I would interpret it. Okay, so first, what is present? So we're going to start on the left hand side. We see a man's torso. We see an assembly line. He's working on the assembly line, evaluating these small widgets, I don't know, salt shakers, disposing the imperfect ones. And that's what we see. On the right hand side, we see a zoomed out view of many people working on this assembly line and the machinery that's running it, right? That's what is presented to me. Now, how is it presented? So on the left hand side, these are all small, equal sized, repetitive panels. They're all the exact same size, they're all very similar. Importantly, I think you cannot see his face. He's literally faceless. The Even though each image is individual and different, they're very similar. On the right-hand side, the machine takes up half the page, and the people are all kind of fuzzy and indistinct. And also, if I look at how lighting is working in this space, all of the light is hitting the machine, and the people seem to be working in the shadow. So now I ask, why? Why is it presented this way? And I think that this left hand page, you feel the monotony, the like faceless, droning monotony of this job. And you wouldn't know this not having read the whole book, but the whole book is very monochrome, and but it changes from like kind of a warm sepia brown and white to a cool gray, like almost blue gray, cold black and white. And this is on the cooler side. And so there's a general like the warmer colors are happier times, the cooler colors are less happy. And so this is a cool gray monotonous existence. And you see the sea of faceless workers working in the shadow of this big machine that is just daunting and overwhelming. And I think that this really encapsulates in one spread his existence as this factory worker. Like you really get a lot about his life and how this society works and how workers are treated. And all of that is happening with no words. All of that is just with interpreting the composition of this spread. So that's just an example. You want to think about, like I said before, space equals time, but think about what is What is your eye drawn to? What is given the most space? What is contrast doing? What is light doing? What's large and exaggerated? What is small and indistinct? What are the characters doing? What can we tell from their body language or their facial expressions? The lighting, like all of that is stuff that you want to think about. And this is why I'm like, if you're reading a graphic novel quickly, you're doing it wrong because you are not reading the images, the individual images, but also the layout, how they are working together cohesively as part of what is being communicated to you. So this is when we actually get a little bit of audience participation, because this is my practice for you. Focalization is the equivalent of point of view. What narrative are we perceiving? Whose narrative are we perceiving? So Annie has a little prompt for you that you will get to answer. Whose perspective are we seeing? Whose point of view is this? And I will give you just a minute to put in your answer. And I did not think about the fact that I can only see my slides and I have no idea what any of you are saying. Um, so you will all know how many of you got it right, and feel good about yourself, or not, depending. But the answer is the point of view that we're seeing is the dog. Now, let's talk about how we know that. So, there are a couple of different things. What is really interesting about this panel from Hawkeye is that your eye is drawn to this blue part right here, this blue square. But that's a trick. That's not the whole panel. Like, you have to include this white area as well. And it's almost like a scientific diagram, right? Where somebody is like focusing in on this and identifying the like things, maybe the smells that I associate with these people. Like, okay, Hawkeye just got out of bed, smells like ibuprofen and beer. And the cops, okay, like gun oil, donuts, coffee, like the siren, like these are the things I associate with this. And then we look at the speech bubbles and notice that only some of the words are actually legible. And anybody who has been around dogs knows that there are some words that dogs know and some that they do not. And so that is a big clue. And my favorite thing about this is that the dog's realm of understanding and focus is completely just right in front of him, and he has no idea what is happening with his tail. His tail is outside. This is Lucky the pizza dog, and his tail is outside of his realm of awareness, which I find to be deeply funny. So that's your kind of test. I hope some of you got it right or all of you got it right. Um, but that is an example of focalization. Like, what is the author choosing to show, and how does that change whose point of view you're seeing? So, if you want to incorporate this into your own reading or your reader's advisory recommendation or your curriculum, I think a great practice idea to learn this, and is just like a cool way to practice, is to take something that has a graphic adaptation and compare apples to apples, right? Take a certain scene and look at how the graphic adaptation handles it and what it looks like in the text. Talk about the artist's interpretations, the assumptions, the things that you see that you weren't necessarily described in the text, but like had to be added to make it sense in a visual medium. Like, there are all kinds of things that you can compare and contrast, and then perhaps then take your own passage and imagine or create like your own. Like, how would you adapt this? Like, what about this would you find important visually, and like how would you visually match the tone of this, like share the emotions and the descriptions in a way that feels the same as it does in the text. I think that we can all see how that would be like a very valuable way of practicing this kind of like critical examination and analysis. Another great idea is just like to pick a classic you've already read and read the graphic adaptation. These are really useful for us in our school for um, we have a huge refugee population and they're, taking classes with other kids their age that are reading, The Great Gatsby. And that's going to be just like more English than they have access to. But if you give them a graphic novel version, they still may not completely understand what's going on, but they've got a fighting chance. It's a little bit easier for them to follow along with what the class is doing. And for some kids, it's also just like a very good review because they can read through the graphic novel and hit the major points of a plot much faster than they can skim back through a text, uh, completely textbook. This is the hill that I will die on, is that Shakespeare should only ever be taught with graphic novels because Shakespeare was meant to be performed. But that's a hard way to teach it in school, to learn it, because the language is so far removed from our language that it's very hard to grapple with. You have to take your time with it. But if you're just reading the text, you miss the set and the costume and the like space between people, the chemistry, the expression, the movement, and so I think that Shakespeare should be written should only be studied in this format at least for like high school. Like once you get into college and are doing more complex things, sure, read the text. But as a way of like introducing kids to it, giving them the costuming, the expression is so huge in helping them understand what's going on, but you can still slow down and spend time with the text. I think it's the best of both worlds. And I feel like everybody should be doing it. There's some great stuff out there. And I also love this as an example of another vocabulary word, emanata, which means to emanate. And so if you think of this actually has a couple different examples. These are their like surprise, what? But this is the iconic, do you bite your thumb at me, sir? Scene in Romeo and Juliet, and the like lines of like tension coming off of this. These aren't physically like visible things. It is like a shot going off in its importance, and that is shown through the emanata. That's something that's like very unique to this format. That's like very cool of making the not visible visible. And I also want to emphasize that this is really useful outside of just literature. There are incredible nonfiction graphic novels that I think are a really good way of teaching data visualization. Because I think we have all met scientists, engineers that could have done a better job of creating data visualizations to support the information that they're giving out. Like it's a good communication skill for making complex things understandable. I use this example, even though it's not technically a graphic novel, but it has like this ongoing narrative of like cavemen and mammoths to talk about like the basic small machines. I grew up with this book, and I'm still convinced it's the reason I got a 5 on my AP physics test because I grew up with like following along with these cavemen and the mammoths as they, figured out simple machines. But it's also just like I love this one. This is a novel, a graphic novel, but at the end there is like a explainer of global warming and climate change, which is impacting the two main characters in the book. One of them lives on the Arctic Circle, and one of them lives. I'm trying to remember. I believe it's off the coast of India, and one of them is dealing with like melting areas and impacting the ecology around her. And one of them lives in a fishing village, and like the rising sea levels is like changing where fish are and like changing where they have to like live. And so after telling that story, they then use images from that story as part of the explainer to like point out what's happening. And so they're taking kind of like the emotional baggage of the story that you just read and integrating that into like science data visualization to kind of point the finger to like, this science has a face and this is the face that you just read about. And that's just like effective communication skills. Like if you are trained to analyze this, you're like, okay, they're using an emotional appeal to make this point, and is that or is that not manipulative? Like if you understand what they're doing, you can make that decision for yourself. So data visualization is something that I think everybody has to do at some point in like their job. And when you are in the habit of looking at images this way, anytime that you're reading the news or reading a report from an employer or an employee, you can look at those images with that same sensitivity. It's like a muscle. You just have to practice it. And so like this is an example of a bad and misleading graph. Usually I ask people, what about this makes it misleading? Um, but I will just kind of mention a couple of things. Like if you look at the actual numbers, you realize that these proportions are very off. But the thing that I noticed immediately is the sizes of these coal carts. Like you would think they should be consistent, but they are not. And so if you actually put the data into just like a spreadsheet, this is what the actual proportions look like. And it's maybe important to know that this was produced by an educational institution in India, right? So having them look like they're closer in competition with China, like it's part of that like information literacy of like understanding the perspective of the person making this data and like why they might be trying to manipulate you with images. Getting in the habit of looking closely at images makes you better at this kind of information literacy. And because I showed you bad information literacy, I wanted to show you what data visualization looks like when it's done really well, because it can be very powerful. And this is an article in Science about like the ecology of like animal migration in urban areas and how like decisions made 100 years ago during like redlining in neighborhoods has over the last 100 years had this pile-on effect of like these different things piling and stacking on top of each other to actually impact migration patterns and diversity of wildlife in urban areas, which I think is very interesting. But they did such a good job of taking complex issues and supporting them with images and using like a very consistent color palette. They're using the language of like green is on the better side, like green means go, red means stop. That's a part of our visual vocabulary. And they did a very good job of utilizing that tool. So I'll kind of blow through this, but I think that we all know that like you're designing posters and emails, you are making alt texts for websites and for social media posts. You are doing a million different things in your jobs, and students will eventually be asked to do a million different things in their jobs that they could be better at if they thought about images in this way and could dissect them in this way. Here's an example of a terrible poster that my principal made and how I fixed it. And I did this by using the rules that I learned from graphic novels, like make the important things bigger, like pay attention to where people's eyes are going, like use impactful symbols that people understand immediately, use the visual vocabulary of colors. Green, you're in the safe zone. Yellow, less safe. Red, less safe. Black, you're in trouble. So that's how I redesigned this so that it's a poster that you can actually kind of read and understand at a distance rather than what my principal did. So, this is a really good, if you want to kind of think about how these impact graphic design, I highly recommend this book. This is a really great practice challenge. Could be a fun team building exercise if you want to redesign a book cover. Book covers are really interesting kind of visual literacy, like how they're communicating genre, how they're communicating age. I feel like a lot of people in library land are very aware that there's kind of been a breakdown in the reliability of this in the like, is it an adult romance or is it a young adult book? Like, there's a real breakdown in that visual vocabulary that's definitely affecting us. So, thinking about how those rules affect book covers, I think is very interesting in our line of work. So, in general, the more that you're thinking like this, the more that you're asking these questions, the better you're going to be at intaking visual media and like dissecting it, critically consuming it, whether that be a graphic novel or a social media post or an ad or whatever, you're going to be a better and more critical consumer of that media. And the more you critically consume that and think about it and analyze it, the better you're going to be at thinking and designing and creating those things that are translatable to other parts of your life that are just like good life skills. So, your takeaways, visual literacy is very important. It's part of critical thinking, it's part of information literacy. Graphic novels are a tool. We're in a golden age of things that we have access to right now. There's so much great stuff out there, but it requires instruction and practice. You have to be explicitly taught how to examine some of this stuff, and you have to practice doing it. And that these real world benefits are good for everyone. That's your patrons, that's you, that's everybody. I am including in here, there's some collection development resources if you want to start bringing in more comic books into your collection. These are, if you want to learn more, these are great things. They're just awesome. Also great to add to your collection. And these are more sort of academic sources that you have access to. And if you would like to read that science article, there's that. I have a podcast. I have an email. That's that's pretty much it. So let me find my way back. I will stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. That was an
Yay.
amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I did see one question that came in sort of at the beginning. So if people have questions that they want to put in the chat, feel free to type those up now.
Yeah.
Um, in the history section, there was a question which I loved of
Mhm.
do you see zines as a part of the history of comics?
100%. I think that the those kind of early kind of political cartoon things, often they were sort of like handbill sized. And um, I think that they're very, very much part of the same history. And I think, especially when the Comics Code Authority happened, a lot of people who didn't want to play by those rules because they were extremely restrictive, a lot of comics went underground. Um, so you those were oftentimes not being because so many publishers went out of business, a lot of them were like independently produced. And they were making the kind of like edgier, grungier underground stuff. And so there were a lot of independent comics happening that way. And comics is really because of um, the complexity, they tend to be very like ink heavy. The technology of like printing has really gone hand in hand in in how the development and like availability of certain types of comics. And so the zine as something like photocopyable and black and white, I think was a very like accessible form of that because uh, a lot of the early printing types for comic books were a lot more expensive than that. So it was a little bit harder to get published. So
Hmm. I have another question.
yeah.
Have there been any studies done exploring whether reading graphic novels as we age, with how they engage the brain in more ways, can be helpful in preventing or slowing the effects of dementia or any other cognitive impairment?
Not that I know of, but, like, I haven't looked at that specifically, mostly because I work in a high school, so that's, like, less of my focus. So it's entirely possible. I know, weirdly, I have read a study about VR, um, and that being very good for dementia. And so I don't know what that says, but like certain video games actually being good for that. But I feel like that is sort of like connecting different parts of your brain, like the physical and the mental. So I'm like, for me, I feel like it can't hurt. I have definitely seen some stuff about it being good for kids because that's the time of your life when you're building the bridge between the hemispheres of your brain, and using the visual and verbal at the same time like actually helps build the bridge between hemispheres. And so I've more read about initial like development than about dementia and Alzheimer's. But I think I would love to look into that. That's a really good question.
Hmm. Good research area of study. What comics have you or your students enjoyed recently?
Um, let's
Hmm.
see. Okay, I just read it's totally bonkers. But the one that like really moved the needle for me was this book called Death Strikes, and it is an adaptation of an opera that was written. I'm gonna get this wrong. It was in not a concentration camp, but in like a Czech, something like a concentration camp. I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like that. But there are these um, two people who wrote this opera, and it's sort of a farcical dystopia, as if Atlantis never fell and became like this like autocratic weird dictator. um and it's a graphic adaptation of that opera, and it's so weird but like so good. And it was just doing really cool things. Another one that I and several of my students have really liked is like it's a very gothic horror called oh my gosh, is it a guest in the house or a stranger in the house? But the way it does um, black and white and then color, like all the main character, it's like her internal landscape and her kind of imaginings of like herself on the mental plane are all in like this vivid color. And so the way that it's playing with black and white and color is really, really cool. Um, But I also just reread The Legend of Auntie Poe, which is a retelling of Paul Bunyan. Yes, Guest in the House. Thank you. Legend of Auntie Poe by Xing Kaur. Actually, just interviewed Xing for an episode of the podcast that's not out yet, but it was a very cool conversation. So I reread Legend of Auntie Poe, which is um, like the daughter of a like Chinese cook in a logging camp, telling her version of Paul Bunyan stories. It's very, very cute and cool, and absolutely loving that. Yeah.
Nice. And Xing was a one of the guest creators at BCAF, the Boise Comic Arts Festival,
Mhm.
this last year, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very cool. very cool creator doing all kinds of cool things.
Mhm.
Did a artist in residence thing at the LA Public Library that should look out and check out. It's very neat. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I think we've got through all the questions.
Okay,
Thank you
fantastic.
again so much. This was such a fantastic
Hmm.
presentation. So many valuable insights. I am going to stop the recording